Absolutely. Actually, even just after the Second World War, there was an art journal, Cobra, and one article is entitled, "In Belgium, good cinema is always experimental." Because indeed there was not a real industrial cinema production. It was mostly artists working with cinematic experiments. And Belgium was, in a sense, it's a small country, but it's at the crossroads of Europe. So it was both influenced by German, but mostly by French experimental cinema, and of course also Soviet experimental cinema was quite known among Belgian avant-garde writers and avant-garde artists. And it was even literal a crossroad, as in December 1930 at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, which was recently just finished, a new building. There was the second Congrès International du Cinéma Indépendant, the second Congress of independent cinema, which assembled the major players of experimental film of Europe. It's indeed difficult, I think, to find a common denominator, but of course it's mostly non-narrative cinema. This includes both, for instance, formalist experiments, but also all kinds of film experiments definitely marked by surrealism. Which included often like semi-narrative or micro-narrative structures in the film, but in order to disrupt, in order to deconstruct the major narrative element. Also maybe, and maybe this is typically Belgian, some more or less ironic, absurd, a kind of interest for the absurd, for instance, also marks many of these Belgian experimental films. The major figures were Henri Storck, Charles de Keukelaere, who made a lot of films, but also an important figure was Henri d'Ursel. He only made one film together with French surrealist artist Georges Huguenet, but he was a major figure in Belgian experimental film circles because he also was one of the co-founders of the Brussels Cinematheque. So he was really an important figure, and he was close to Paris surrealist circles. Apart from that, there are still other figures who were interesting and important, and one figure I need to mention is the famous artist René Magritte, who was a cinephile, who made several paintings that refer to 1910s, 1920s cinema, for instance. But he also made a series of 8mm films himself in the late 40s and early 50s. That really depends. Filmmakers like Henri Storck and Charles de Keukelaere, they are considered major figures in Belgian cinema. They became, later on in the 1930s, they became famous with their documentary films. Some of their films have been lost, but still some of the major films of the 1920s are still intact. And they are at the Belgian Cinematheque. Some of them are even released on DVD. Also La Perle by Henri d'Ursel is available on DVD, for instance. But there are other cases that are quite problematic. Some are lost, or still considered lost. Some films are still intact, but are difficult to show because of copyrights or because they are very rare copies and things like that. So it really depends. Well, also this depends, I think. There is definitely a kind of lineage. Because also after the war, Belgian documentary cinema was very interesting, I would say. And Henri Storck, for instance, he always supported young artists, even up until the end of his life in the 1990s. But for instance, he also supported Chantal Akerman. He plays a minor part in Jean Dillemont. He is the first customer visiting Jean Dillemont. So there is this kind of lineage, definitely. And of course, surrealism in particular became a kind of part of Belgian cultural identity, and many of these films play on this. heritage or play on this kind of affiliation already in the early 30s. But on the other hand, it would be wrong, I would say, to identify Belgian avant-garde cinema in its entirety with surrealism. And there's so much more. Also, for instance, constructivist elements were very important for Charles de Keukelaere. He was also a major film critic, working for a very interesting art journal in the 1920s, which was called Sept Arts, Seven Arts, which is of course a literal reference to Rachuto Konudo's famous article on the cinema as the seventh art. And cinema was very prominently present in the pages of that journal, for instance.